Do you remember the original Paul Harvey radio show? I used to love that show. It saved me from countless hours of boredom during my summer jobs when I was a young man growing up in East Longmeadow, Massachusetts, trying to work my way through college. I would literally set up my radio at my workstation each day and look forward to the amazing stories that Paul Harvey would tell. And as I understand it, that program still runs on over 1,000 radio stations nationwide. But the whole idea behind that show was that Paul Harvey would take various topics and stories that people thought they were pretty familiar with, and he would tell them a true part of the behind-the-scenes story that they had never even heard of before. And so he'd end each compelling program with a surprise conclusion, and then would come the famous phrase, "And now you know the rest of the story." And most of the time, you'd walk away with your mouth gaping wide open, mumbling to yourself, "That is absolutely unbelievable. I never knew that." Because Paul Harvey was an expert at finding stories that we thought we were familiar with until we heard the rest of the story. In fact, let me give you a short clip of one of Paul Harvey's actual broadcasts so that you can get an idea of exactly what I'm talking about.
Author Philip Van Doren Stern got the idea one winter morning in 1938 while he was shaving. He was shaving, and the entire story came to him beginning to end right there in front of the bathroom mirror. But Philip would not write the story down until a year later, and he would not try to sell the story until 4 more years had passed, and even then nobody would buy it. He tried to interest magazines in publishing it. He was turned down by everything from the Saturday Evening Post to the local farm journals. Finally, a movie studio bought the story, which the author had entitled The Greatest Gift. RKO Radio Pictures purchased the property at the suggestion of Cary Grant, by the way. Cary Grant thought the hero might be a suitable role for himself someday. And yet, try as they might, RKO screenwriters simply could not adapt the story to a movie-worthy script, so more years passed. RKO sold The Greatest Gift to another movie maker who had just organized a new company called Liberty Films. That producer-director's name, by the way, was Frank Capra. And under his loving guidance, Philip Stern's Little Christmas Story did grow into one of the most moving and heartwarming tales ever told. And each Christmas time, televiewers thrilled to the retelling of an all-American yarn which Frank Capra retitled, It's a Wonderful Life. But this is the rest of the story. The motion picture, It's a Wonderful Life, is about a man named George Bailey on the brink of suicide, granted a unique opportunity to see what the world would have been like had he never been born. It's a Wonderful Life has become a classic, consistently listed by critics among the 10 greatest movies ever made, but it did not become an American cultural phenomenon until the mid-1970s, and there's a reason for that, aside from its intrinsic greatness. For you see, when It's a Wonderful Life first appeared in theaters, December 1946, it received mixed reviews. It barely broke even at the box office, received not one Academy Award. Its less than spectacular reception was a tremendous disappointment to Frank Capra. It was so generally ignored over the following 3 decades that in 1974, when its copyright came up for renewal, somebody in the studio office forgot or didn't bother to go to the trouble of renewing the copyright, and that's how one of the 10 greatest motion pictures of all times slipped inobtrusively into what's called the public domain. And that's why America's undisputed favorite holiday movie became just that, because television stations can air it for free. And so they air it often, exposing it to millions. Experts guesstimate that the owners, had they held on to the copyright, It's a Wonderful Life would be earning them conservatively $26 million a year. In addition to the more than 1,200 radio and television stations airing it at least twice each year, there are 15 video companies selling the classic on cassette. They're cranking out copies for what amounts to the wholesale cost of blank tape. That's right. To paraphrase its original title, maybe that is the greatest gift of all. That we all get rich every Christmas time. In lots of ways. Because we get to see and re-see and re-see It's a Wonderful Life. Just because somebody, maybe some bumbling guardian angel, failed to renew the copyright. By the way, had that whoever it was back there bothered to renew the copyright, it would have cost his employers a renewal fee of only $4. Merry Christmas And now you know the rest of the story.
Now be honest, you never knew that about the movie It's a Wonderful Life, did you? And it was exactly that kind of surprise element when Paul Harvey brought new light to an old story that up to that point had been only one half told that made Paul Harvey's radio program so fascinating. And the thing was, he always used topics and people and stories that you thought you were very familiar with until he told you the real ending. I was always amazed over how little I knew and how much I had believed about the one half of those stories that I had always assumed were the whole story. Well, that's a pretty good picture of what goes on all of the time in many circles of the modern church today. And I want to be clear here so that you can catch the real danger of this error. What more and more pastors and preachers, and even Christians in general, are doing is they are presenting half-truths about Scripture, as if they were the whole truth. And that, in the end, makes them untruths. Because if you're only getting a half-truth, even though what you're hearing may be technically or partially accurate, it becomes very easy to walk away with a very wrong impression. Here, let me give you a relatively harmless practical illustration from everyday life. Let's suppose that you woke up one morning and your 15-year-old son told you that it was raining out today. So realizing that there's no urgency in getting up to cut the lawn, you roll over, go back to sleep, and he's very satisfied with that decision because he was scheduled to help you. An hour or two later, you arise to find that it's not only a clear sunny day now, but that it has been since sunrise. And when you press your son on the issue, you're informed that, well, all he meant was, "Gee, Dad, it's raining somewhere today, just not here." Would you be pleased? No, of course not. In fact, you'd be right in pointing out to your son what, even at 15 years of age, he already very much knows. That his half-truth statement may have been technically accurate, but because of its incompleteness, it wasn't truthful. It, in actuality, was quite misleading because, based on his incomplete information, you drew a false conclusion. Well, again, that's the error that we as Christians are facing more and more in the modern church. Because there are some pastors and preachers who are increasingly giving their listeners only one half of many doctrinal stories. And then they selectively cite only certain verses or passages that apply to the subject that they might be teaching on at that given time, leaving out entire blocks of other very relevant verses and passages. Verses and passages that, if they were included in the teaching, would alter dramatically the final conclusion that could be drawn about the topic that's being taught. And I'm not trying to be unduly critical of such pastors or preachers, nor am I saying that it's possible to preach comprehensively on every single subject in every single sermon. I'm merely attempting to point out that Christians, all Christians, need to be particularly aware of this dangerous phenomenon that is increasingly taking place in the modern church. Because people in the pews are frequently hearing sermons that are only half the story about God and the things of God. And make no mistake about it, this is a very, very easy error to get sucked into, because it's very easy to look at a Bible verse or a passage or a biblical doctrine, or to hear a sermon or a teaching that seems to be the whole story on a subject, and that is even backed up by a virtual litany of other individual verses and passages taken out of their context, only to discover that you've only been getting half of the story all along. If you ever end up discovering that error at all. So that's why in this program, on how to rightly interpret Scripture, we're going to look at this very subtle and deceptive way that bad doctrine is being introduced into the church today. We're going to see for ourselves how, through an error called selective citing, it is possible to consistently get only half the story on important biblical teachings and never even know it.